There's no general thing you can say about nonviolence in the movement. I think you have to look at particular pieces and places of the movement. Nonviolence played an important role as a tactic in the sit-in movement. It was the tactic, it was a conscious decision. This did not represent a philosophical commitment to nonviolence as a way of life. Very few of the students involved in the sit-in movement were committed to nonviolence as a way. It was a common sense tactic that seemed to work. In the rural areas where we worked as organizers, the question of nonviolence becomes moot. You don't enter into these communities, engage in nonviolent workshops. If you're trying to organize people, you live within the mores of this community. So there were very few households I lived in. In fact, I can't think of any in, say, Mississippi, in the Delta, that didn't have guns. And if they used guns for self-defense, they didn't turn to you and ask you if it was okay. You know, they grabbed their guns and they drove away the night riders. I mean, that's just the way life was. The guns were there primarily to put food on the table, but the guns were also there to be used when necessary and when people thought it would be effective and possible for self-defense. And there was nothing a small group like us could have said that was going to change that. The story I like to tell, I mentioned earlier that I had been arrested for the shooting that followed the second attempt at voter registration in Ruleville, Mississippi. Well, within the context of my arrest, the mayor confiscated the gun of the man I'm staying with, Joe McDonald. Now I'm let out of jail the next morning, and I go back to Mr. McDonald's house, Mr. Joe as we used to call him. Now he's worried about the fact that he doesn't have his gun. And his worry is not about protecting us. His worry has to do with food on the table. And we tell him that he has a right to his gun. And he asks us, are we sure? And because we're in this community working on voter registration, we have all these materials, which include a copy of the Constitution. So we whip out the Constitution and we read the Second Amendment out loud to him. We say, you see, Mr. Joe, it says so right here in the U.S. Constitution that you have a right to your gun. And forget about it. And about a half an hour, 45 minutes later, we noticed that Mr. Joe is nowhere to be seen. So I asked his wife, Rebecca, I said, well, where's Mr. Joe? And she says, well, he went to get his gun. You said it was all right. now I'm worried because the last thing you want in these communities is somebody to get hurt or even killed because they're doing something you said. So we go tearing out the house, down to the jail, and there's Mr. Joe leaning in the door saying over and over again, I come to get my gun. And the deputy, town marshal, gives him his gun back. And he puts it on his shoulder and walks back up the road with us kind of trailing along behind him. And that's the culture there. And there's no way you can inject into this culture the notion of nonviolence. We didn't see it as particularly important to raise the question of nonviolence. It would come up every now and then in different kinds of ways because obviously the dynamic changes a little bit when you enter the white community. You're no longer defending your home from, say, nighttime marauders, but you're at the county courthouse. So I had one guy tell me in this county, he says, look, I know what you're doing is important, but I'm not going down there to register to vote because I'm not going down there without my pistol. And if these white people start to mess with me, I'm going to shoot some of them. And I know that's going to cause you some trouble. So I don't want to get you in any trouble, so I'm just not going. Yeah, so that's how it came up in day-to-day life, that sort of thing. It never even occurred to us that we would challenge the tradition of self-defense or carrying arms. And most of the time, we were glad people had guns in the house. And most of the time, we were glad people had guns in the car. Not that we wanted some kind of shootout or anything like that. But I've told people then, and I tell people now, if people didn't have guns and if whites didn't know that black people had guns, there have been a lot more killing in that state.